He's one of the most important figures in human history. The first great church planter who planted churches all over the Mediterranean, effectively ushering Christianity into Europe, changing the fabric of Western civilization. He preached in front of crowds and mobs before governors and kings. His writings are among some of the most important literary works ever written. He wrote 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Those writings have been meticulously and carefully studied for the last 2,000 years, not just by people in the church, but also the academy. His theological ideas have influenced every aspect of church life. And I'm talking, of course, about the Apostle Paul. He played a critical role in the expansion of the Christian faith into the Gentile world. He traveled somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 miles on his missionary journeys, sometimes by ship, but most of it by foot. That's a distance greater than the distance between New York City and Singapore. That's a time before cars, before steam engines. And of course, his travels were anything but pleasant or easy. By his own account, he was imprisoned on several occasions, run out of town more than once, whipped and beaten numerous times, sometimes with rods, sometimes with stones. He endured countless dangers, multiple shipwrecks. He was ridiculed and flogged. He sacrificed every comfort known to man, a life on the road, no wealth, no money, no family, eventually giving up his life for what he believed in when he was executed, oddly enough, in Rome. But why? Why would Paul do it? What gave Paul such drive, such determination? And what is so important about his message that he had to share it with the world? And he was willing to die for it. These are the questions we will be asking this fall as we start a new sermon series beginning today on the theology of Paul. A sermon series that we're calling Christ is All. Now, of course, there has been plenty of criticism of the Apostle Paul in our generation. Many of the things that he wrote about are unpopular today, often highly misunderstood. Many modern folks don't like what Paul had to say about things like sexuality or gender roles, his apparent tolerance of slavery, or his take on political engagement in general. I remember during my time in seminary, I found that there's a lot of folks studying to go into ministry that liked talking about Jesus and the things that Jesus did and taught. There's also a lot of folks who didn't like talking so much about Paul. And I understand all of that. But you cannot separate Jesus from Paul. And if you're willing to dive deep into Paul's theology, what would you find there? You'll find grace, hope, redemption, new creation, some of the most beautiful, most important theological writings ever written. If you're willing to study Paul, to read Paul, you'll find a man who is immersed in the teachings of the Old Testament. His mind is saturated with the Old Testament. Almost everything that he quotes or writes is something from the Old Testament. You'll find a man who's convinced that Jesus is the promised Messiah, a man who is absolutely head over heels in love with Jesus. And you'll find a man who had experienced the grace of God in a deep and personal and transformative way. Remember, Paul went from being the biggest critic, enemy of the church, to becoming the most important leader of the church. So this fall, we study Paul. That wasn't supposed to rhyme, but it did. But I would go further to say that Paul's theology is just as relevant today as it ever was, which I hope you will discover over these next few months with me. And the writings of the Apostle Paul They're not just archaic, distant writings that are reserved simply for the church in the first century, but as Bible scholar Michael Gorman has said, we too, the church today, we are a part of Paul's original audience. We are a part of that Christian community that was started 2,000 years ago. So this morning we begin covering the major themes in Paul's theology. Over the next few months, we're going to be bouncing around his letters, looking at some of the most common themes that reoccur in Paul's writings. But this morning, we begin with this passage from Romans 1 because I believe it's the perfect introductory passage. And I say that because when Paul first wrote Romans, he was actually introducing himself to a group of people he had never met before. By the time Paul wrote Romans, he had never been to Rome. And so this letter is a way of introducing himself and introducing his understanding of the gospel. It's a remarkable book. But our question this morning is this: what did Paul mean when he talked about the gospel of God? Paul begins his letter, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son. Now, in these first three verses, we notice two things. First of all, that the gospel was promised by God in the Old Testament. And second, that the gospel is concerning God's own Son. The idea that the gospel was promised by God beforehand is critical because it proves that God is following a specific plan that he is unfolding over time since the beginning. In other words, God is not flying by the seat of his pants. Think about this. If Jesus had just shown up in history without any prophetic foretelling, without any divine agent warning us that the Messiah was coming, just some guy popping up in history, telling everybody that he was the Son of God, chances are he would have gotten killed a lot sooner. But because his followers were waiting for a Messiah, the one who had been promised when he did finally appear, and they saw the signs, they knew he was the Messiah. And the fact that the Scriptures promised a Messiah also proves the fact that God keeps his word. He keeps his promises. When you promise something, and then when you deliver on that promise, you prove yourself to be trustworthy and true. So when the Old Testament says that the Messiah will be a descendant of David, God kept his word in Jesus. When the Old Testament says the Messiah would be a healer, that the eyes of the blind would be opened, the deaf would be able to hear, the crippled would leap for joy, God kept his promise in Jesus. When the Old Testament says the Messiah would be the Prince of Peace, God kept his promise in Jesus. When the Old Testament promises that a suffering servant will come who will bear the sins of his people, God kept his promise in Jesus. And when the Old Testament promises that through the descendants of Abraham, God would bless the whole world, God kept his promise in Jesus. But back to that original question. What did Paul mean when he talked about the gospel? And why does it matter? Why does it matter to us 2,000 years later? It matters because the gospel, as Paul describes it, offers some of the greatest solutions to our deepest needs within the human heart. And I'm talking about forgiveness, adoption, and hope. Things that whether we know it or not, they're things that we all need. And so this morning we're going to unpack those three major themes in Paul's understanding of the gospel: forgiveness, adoption, and hope. First, with forgiveness. If you ever read the book of Romans, you know that Paul begins his great explanation of the gospel in the first few chapters by showing that all people are guilty. He says all people are guilty. No one is righteous, not even one. All people are under the power of sin, and all people have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is his opening argument in the book of Romans. But Paul also says throughout his letters, forgiveness is freely offered through Jesus Christ. But people today will respond to this idea and say, well, you know what? We actually don't need forgiveness anymore because we've done nothing wrong. Of course, this line of thinking is grounded in the postmodern philosophical movement, the idea that morality is relative and you ought never to feel guilt or shame again. Also rooted in the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, free love with no consequences, no shame, no guilt. Sounds great. But is it true? As much as people want to say they don't need forgiveness anymore, the reality is that they do. And not just philosophically or theologically, but physically and biologically, humans need forgiveness. There's an interesting fact that science and the academic community, this idea of forgiveness has become a whole field of study in the psychological world. Scientists have found that forgiving someone or experience forgiveness for yourself is actually good for your health. It's good for your heart. It's good for your blood pressure. It's good for your brain. When you retain bitterness deep down inside, it actually starts to affect you physically. People might say that the age of guilt and shame is over. But if that's the case, why do so many people feel utter disgust with themselves? There's clear correlations with the persistent feelings of shame and self-hate that are directly related to the increasing rates of depression and anxiety. And a lot of these folks who are depressed or anxious have a serious critical view of themselves, also known as shame. We could say that shame doesn't exist anymore all we want, but the reality is it does. People might say you ought not to feel guilt, you ought not to feel shame, but deep down inside they do. But of course the Bible already knew all of this. That people need forgiveness to thrive. They need to feel forgiven. They need to practice forgiveness with their own relationships. Chad Bird was a seminary professor and a Bible scholar. And a number of years ago, he cheated on his wife. He ended up losing his job, his family, his wife, his kids. He became a truck driver, and he would spend his nights alone in his studio apartment with a bottle of Jack Daniels in one hand and a handgun in the other. But during this dark time in Chad's life, he recalls a conversation that he had with one of his friends, and his friend said, "You know, Chad, you just need to learn to forgive yourself." And he tried to do it. Chad tried to forgive himself, but the more he tried, the more he discovered that it wasn't enough. Self-forgiveness wouldn't do. He needed a source of forgiveness that was bigger than himself. He needed transcendent forgiveness to come into his life. He needed it from his Creator. And the truth is, we all do. We need a forgiveness that's bigger than what we can muster up on our own. As humans, we all struggle with shame and self-doubt or a need to justify ourselves. But when we experience the total, encompassing forgiveness of Christ, He takes away your shame. He relieves you of that constant need to prove yourself or justify yourself because you are accepted not based on what you do, but by the grace and forgiveness of God. In Christ, we are forgiven, and we are invited to cast our shame and our guilt on to Him. Do it because it's good for your health, and it's good for your soul. But the gospel doesn't just offer us forgiveness, it also offers us adoption, another important theme in Paul's understanding of the gospel. The truth is, you can forgive someone, and then still have no relationship with them whatsoever. If we're being honest, that happens more than we're willing to admit. Yeah, I might forgive you, but that doesn't mean I have to be in relationship with you. The truth is, we need more from God than just a simple declaration of forgiveness. We need a repaired relationship with God, and that's why adoption is so incredibly important. It's not just about being forgiven, it's about being brought into a renewed and restored relationship with God. This is Paul's understanding of the gospel. He says in Romans 8, "You have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, 'Abba, Father,' it is the very same Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ." Bible scholar J.I. Packer once said that our understanding of Christianity cannot be better than our understanding of adoption. In other words, you want to understand how this whole thing works. Look at the image of adoption. All humans, we all understand feelings of loneliness and isolation. And the truth is, the loneliness epidemic is actually getting worse, especially here in the western part of the world. There was a major hospital in Texas that had been experiencing overcrowding in their ER for a very long time. And so they conducted a study to see what is causing all of these ER trips at their particular large hospital in Texas. And you know what they found? It wasn't some new disease. It wasn't some epidemic. It was loneliness. Somehow, the majority of these people were ending up in the ER by themselves with nobody at home to look out for them or care for them. And those feelings continue to grow. But the truth is, you don't have to live your life that way. The gospel offers us a new family, a restored, repaired relationship with our Creator. I love the story of the Ethiopian eunuch from the book of Acts, chapter 8. You remember this story? The eunuch was a court official, a representative of the Queen of Ethiopia, and he's traveling from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to worship. This was a long and dangerous trip. But because he was a foreigner and a eunuch, when he got to Jerusalem, he would have been turned away at the temple because you are not allowed into the temple if you're a eunuch or a foreigner. He's both. Double exclusion. But as he's making his way back to Ethiopia, probably somewhat depressed, he's reading the prophet Isaiah and he comes across a Jesus follower named Philip. And Philip shares the gospel with him. And as they're riding along in the eunuch's chariot, they come across some water, and the eunuch says, "What is to prevent me from being baptized?" I love the fact that he asks the question, what is to prevent me? Because he is someone who has been prevented from experiencing things in the past. And what does Philip do? He baptizes him in the water. The eunuch moves from being an outsider to an insider in a moment, adopted into God's family. A man who would have known profound loneliness. He's a eunuch, he doesn't have family. He's a servant, doesn't have a life mission of his own. He serves that of his queen. And yet he is adopted into God's family. At its core, the gospel is more than just forgiveness. It's about a restored relationship. It's about adoption. But it's also about hope. Paul says in Romans 8 that in hope we are saved. And hope is no minor thing. We cannot live without hope. Stuart Strachan writes this: "Survival requires more than the basic biological necessities we readily acknowledge, oxygen, food, and water. It also demands something less tangible but equally vital: hope. When hope vanishes, the human spirit can begin to falter in ways that are genuinely life-threatening. The devastating power of hopelessness became tragically evident during the major conflicts of the 20th century. Military physicians documented a phenomenon they termed as give-up-itis, very scientific. They've developed this term called give-up-itis among prisoners of war from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. These individuals, confronted with brutal conditions and no visible path to freedom, would descend into profound despair. The progression was heartbreakingly predictable. Demoralization gave way to complete apathy. Prisoners would eventually refuse food and water, withdrawing into vacant stares at nothing. Stripped of any belief in a future worth living, they gradually succumbed not to violence or disease, but to the absence of hope itself. That is what killed them. I think we're seeing some of that in our world today. A growing sense of despair and hopelessness. And what that does to humanity, because we cannot live without hope. But in the Bible, hope isn't about optimism or wishful thinking. Hope is bold expectation of what will come. At the beginning of this sermon, I asked a question: why would Paul go through so much suffering to share his message about the gospel? It's because he was a man who had been personally transformed by hope. It wasn't wishful thinking for Paul. It was bold expectation because he was a man who had encountered the risen Lord. He believed it because he knew it was true. And Paul's life had been changed by God's grace. God's grace is an incredible thing. It's undeserved merit, unconditional love, and it's transformational. Whenever I think of God's grace, I often think of the story from Les Miserables, the encounter between Jean Valjean and the bishop. Now, Valjean has just finished serving a lifelong prison sentence for stealing bread. And on one night on a rainy night with nowhere to go, he's offered shelter at a bishop's home. But in the night, Valjean steals silver from the bishop and runs away. The next day, he's caught by local authorities. The silver is found in his pack, and he's brought back to the bishop for condemnation. But Valjean is stunned when the bishop does not condemn him, but offers him grace and says these words: "Forget not, never forget, that you have promised to me to use this silver to become an honest man, Jean Valjean. My brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I'm buying for you. I withdraw it from dark thoughts and from the spirit of perdition, and I give you back to God." It's a beautiful picture of what the gospel is. Forgiveness of the past and hope for what God can do in your life in the future. Paul's message of the gospel ultimately is always an invitation. It's an announcement of what God has done and what God offers us: forgiveness, adoption, hope, new life, new creation, transformation. But it's always an invitation. And you have to decide what you're going to do with that invitation. Do you find yourself carrying shame, self-loathing, going through life feeling unattached, alone, despairing? How are you feeling about the future? In the gospel, we are offered the greatest solutions to all of those things and so much more. But again, what will you do with that invitation? Let's pray.